This is the Samsung S25 Fan Edition, and in terms of camera quality you could pretty much sum it up as having two decent and very usable cameras that produce excellent results, and then two rather meh ones that you should probably avoid most of the time. Let's get into it. First, I want to say that I bought this phone with my own money and I had no contact with Samsung whatsoever, so my opinion on it is completely unbiased. So what we have here is a total of 4 cameras. We have 3 in the back, one main wide angle, one ultra wide and one telephoto lens. And then on the front we of course have a selfie camera. Now the main wide angle lens has a resolution of 50 megapixel, whereas the telephoto and the ultra wide have 8 and 12 megapixels. Let's start with the ultra wide, and here we are working with a 1/3 inch sensor paired with an aperture of f2.2 and the resolution of 12 megapixels. Very simplified, image quality in phone tends to get better the more light is collected by the image sensor. And you get more light by having a bigger sensor that is able to collect more light, as well as a bigger lens opening, a larger lens opening or aperture that lets more light in, which then hits the sensor. And mind that small numbers mean large aperture and big numbers mean small aperture, so that's a bit confusing here. And the resolution, the megapixels, don't really translate to image quality, but more so on how much you can crop into the image while still having detail. And 12 megapixels in the case of our ultra wide here doesn't allow for a whole lot of cropping. Alright, so in terms of sensor size we have a rather small one here with also not the largest aperture when comparing it to other ultra-wide smartphone cameras. So we can't expect too much in terms of image quality, and as expected it is just not really good at all. There's no detail, it is over-sharpened, there's lots of chromatic aberration going on, up here in the trees especially. And while given the price difference it is totally okay that the iPhone 17 Pro does a way better job here. But I do think that also my 4-year-old iPhone 13 is a little bit better. Speaking of iPhone, I will compare the S25 Fan Edition with my iPhone 17 Pro throughout this video. And this should by no means diminish the quality of the Samsung here, because I know that of course they are at vastly different price points, but it should give you some sort of benchmark to compare it to, so that you have some sort of reference. But let's zoom out again, because of course these days most smartphone photographs stay on a phone and people look at them on their phone screens and don't zoom in like crazy, and then it's fine I guess. Especially when looking at a scene like this one here. Here for ultra-wide landscapes it also doesn't matter that the ultra-wide on the S25 Fan Edition has no autofocus, because everything will be in focus by default at this focal length pretty much. All in all, I would say use the ultra-wide with caution, and whenever you can go to the standard wide-angle lens, which is actually very good, but more on that later. For now, let's have a look at the 3x telephoto lens. Here we are working with an 8 megapixel 1/4.4 inch sensor, which is incredibly small. And the below average aperture of 2.4 doesn't help either. I mean, essentially it is the same story as with the ultra wide. It is there, which is nice I guess, but it just isn't anything to write home about. It is okay in bright daylight, but straight up unusable in low light, but more on that later. Generally, I feel with this phone that the telephoto lens is almost obsolete in a way. Because when we look at the main wide-angle camera with its 50 megapixel sensor, you have the ability to crop into the image by so much that you almost match the quality of the optical zoom. I mean, just look at the church here. One image is the 3x telephoto lens and the other is the normal wide-angle lens cropped in. The point is the telephoto lens resolves a tiny bit more detail, but not a lot at all. And with the wide angle you obviously have the added flexibility to use the whole frame as well. Of course it does require a bit more work on your end, as you have to manually reframe the image, but I do think that Samsung could have actually gone without the telephoto lens and also the ultra wide for that matter, and solely focus on the main wide angle lens, which is indeed a good performer. Here we have a 1/1.56 inch sensor, which is of decent size, paired with an aperture of f1.8, which is also pretty good. It is the exact same camera you find on the normal Galaxy S25, for example. And the resolution is 50 megapixels, which gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of cropping and reframing, as I said before. Overall, a very capable combo, and when we look at this wide-angle shot, I think that the Samsung S25 Fan Edition straight up beats the iPhone 17 Pro. Both in terms of detail, but also in terms of white balance and color. It is just really good. And that's great to see in a mid-range phone. It also has less noise and doesn't look so over-sharpened as the iPhone. Now, here we have a different shot in the forest that is a bit more challenging, as we have very bright areas here where the sun hits, as well as dark shadows from the trees. And here's the other way around. I like the iPhone a lot more. The Samsung's metering was a bit off in my opinion, as it's slightly overexposed. And the image is a bit too cool for my taste. The iPhone shot just looks a lot more inviting and natural here. In terms of detail, I can't say that either one is significantly better or worse, which I think is a compliment for the Samsung again, given the price difference. Then I have one more image, again the Samsung leaning more towards cool and magenta, while the iPhone is warmer and has better green tones in my opinion. But in the end, this is a matter of personal taste, and it's a bit different from image to image really, because with the first photo of the village with the church, I like the colors of the Samsung better. Now, when we zoom in again, in terms of detail, they are at the same level, but I slightly prefer the Samsung actually because it doesn't add so much sharpening. I think it just looks better when it's done in a more natural way. Now, very popular among many people is portrait mode, which we now find in most phones. What it does is it cuts out the subject and artificially blurs the background to sort of emulate the look of a bigger sensor that has less depth of field and a large aperture. Now, traditionally portraits are done with telephoto lenses so that we can have some distance to our subjects and don't distort facial features like, you know, when you're close to the camera and have big noses and all that stuff. So therefore the go-to for portraits with phones would also be to use the telephoto lens, but of course the image quality is often worse than on the main wide-angle shooter. Nevertheless, I tried some full-body portraits of my lovely girlfriend here with the telephoto lens of the S25 Fan Edition, and the results are so-so in my opinion. But I guess, especially when viewed on a phone, they are good enough. Now, when looking at a wide-angle lens, of course, things get better, but it just looks somewhat weird and distorted in my opinion. I do like the artificial transition from in focus to out of focus though. I think it looks quite natural. Now, when doing a close-up portrait, in order to avoid the aforementioned distortion, the phone switches back to the telephoto lens, and being that close, you notice the cutout effect much more when you look at your shoulders, for example. There's no natural transition whatsoever. If you would have photographed this with a bigger sensor camera, her shoulders would be already blurry as well. The iPhone 17 Pro does that really well in my opinion. I think here it is way better. Also, it has much more detail due to the higher resolution sensor and bigger sensor for that matter. But what annoys me most with the Samsung is this too obvious cutout effect, and this has nothing to do with camera hardware, but it's only software. Now, on the other hand, what really surprised me was the front-facing camera. It is truly excellent. It offers great skin tones, lots of detail, and looks very natural and pleasing to the eye. It seems to be the same selfie camera as we find on the highest end Samsung models like the S25 Ultra, for example, with a 1/3.2 inch sensor and an aperture of f2.2. In fact, in this scenario, it performs way better than the iPhone, although we are comparing it to the 15 Pro in this case, because after the fall of my 17 Pro, the shattered display unfortunately impacted the autofocus of the front camera. So yeah, if you want to hear about the story of how I broke the screen of my new 17 Pro after a few days of ownership, click here. Anyway, I don't think that there would be a huge quality difference between the 17 Pro and the 15 Pro, which in this case here is far too yellow and less detailed and much more noisy than the Samsung, even though it was captured at the lower ISO. And it's the same story in portrait mode. Again, really excellent results of the Samsung here, and I don't know how much software magic is going on in the background here, but kudos to Samsung. Next, let's have a look at how it handles backlight, like when there is a light source directly behind your subject, like the sun for example. In this case here I used my key light with big softbox I used for my YouTube videos. Now, I think this is fine. We lose some contrast here and everything gets a bit hazy, but honestly not too bad. And again, when comparing it to the iPhone 17 Pro as a reference again, it is cleaner, has more contrast, but also underexposes a bit, which hides its flaws to some extent. And again, we see that the Samsung gravitates towards a much cooler and magenta leaning image, whereas the iPhone is warmer and has more green tones. All in all, I think this is a good performance by the Samsung. Next up, we have macro mode, and the S25 Fan Edition straight up has no dedicated macro mode. But again, with the help of the 50 megapixel main camera, you have the ability to crop into the image a fair amount. And thus you can achieve something that comes close to macro. For example, I took some images of this watch here and I tried to focus on the date window here. And well, for example, the iPhone 17 Pro with its dedicated macro mode does a phenomenal job. Of course, the S25 Fan Edition cropped in is not too shabby either. And also it does the cropping in part for you, because when you're very close to your subject and then you press the 3x button here, it uses the main camera and crops in automatically. It only uses the optical telephoto lens when your subject is farther away, because the lens has a minimum focus distance of about 50 to 60 centimeters. So while not the phone of choice for macro, it is possible to make the occasional close-up shot. Now let's have a look at nighttime photography, and here I tried to have a somewhat real-world scenario where I first didn't use a tripod at all, but rather tried to hand-hold it and trust the night mode. And when using the main camera, I think you get a decent result. In fact, not too far off the iPhone 17 Pro. The iPhone, however, seems to have a slightly more sophisticated stabilization system and thus expose half a second instead of a quarter second, which helps overall exposure in detail a bit. Also, both the Samsung and the iPhone drop down to a 12 megapixel image in night mode, as they do something called pixel binning in order to get a cleaner image with less noise. Now, while the main wide-angle lens offers good performance, the ultra-wide as well as the telephoto are sadly completely unusable in low light. With the telephoto, I plain and simple wasn't able to get the autofocus to work in 90% of the time, regardless of being on a tripod or handheld. Most likely this is because of the tiny sensor and relatively small aperture we have for the telephoto lens, and the ultra-wide, well, it doesn't have an autofocus to begin with, so yeah, but it's a mess too. Now let's talk about pro features, and coming from an iPhone, I think it's great that we have a built-in professional mode in the camera where you have complete manual control over ISO, shutter speed and white balance. Unfortunately for the ultra-wide, for whatever reason, it only lets you increase the shutter speed to a max of half a second, so that didn't help the low light ultra-wide images at all. But for the main camera, we can easily put it on a tripod and dial in the exposure of 15 seconds, for example, and then we have a really nice image that beats an iPhone 17 Pro with its normal night mode inside its normal camera app. I really like this feature. Now, in terms of other professional features, we do have the ability to shoot RAW files, which is amazing, and I do think that these hold up pretty well when pushing them to the limits. Albeit there's a little less dynamic range than in the iPhone, but this is to be expected at literally double the price. I mean, it is great that we even have the ability to shoot RAW on a mid-range phone like this one in the first place. Alright, now let's talk about video. And the Samsung S25 Fan Edition offers normal 4K video at up to 60 frames per second, with back and front facing cameras, as well as 8K video up to 30 frames per second with the main camera. Now, similar to the Pro mode for photography, there also exists a Pro mode for video, where you can manually dial in shutter speed and ISO and white balance, which is a nice feature and allows for things like 180-degree shutter angle. But of course you could also download the Blackmagic video app, for example, which is free, and you have much more features and options. Now, in terms of quality, well, I tested everything here at my A-roll docking head setup, and I started off with the 8K. And honestly, I think this is more of a gimmick on this phone, because at least in my testing here, it looks way worse than the phone's 4K. Obviously, the 8K is downsampled to 4K in post, but you should see a noticeable improvement when cropping in, which you don't in my opinion. At 300%, I still think that the 4K looks better. But of course, also the 4K looks like your typical smartphone video, as it has lots of over sharpening going on here, and it is nowhere near as good as the iPhone with its capability to shoot in Apple log without the baked in sharpness. And this is in normal H.265 on the iPhone, so no ProRes or ProRes RAW, which would look even better. Of course, when you go to something like an S25 Ultra, you also get the ability to shoot log, and I think it would be very unusual for a mid-range phone like this one to offer such a feature, so this is fine. Okay, real quick future Simon here, and regarding the bad looking 8K I was talking about, I was reading through Reddit and somebody suggested that you should turn off stabilization. I thought I had turned off stabilization because I was of course on a tripod, but I had not. And after turning off stabilization, it does look a little bit better. Weirdly, there's less noise, not a lot more detail, but definitely cleaner and more usable. Now, of course, similar to the competition, the S25 FE also has the ability to record cinematic or portrait video, which is essentially a video variant of portrait mode, and unsurprisingly it looks bad and shouldn't be used in my opinion. But at this point that's pretty much universal, and it also looks bad on the iPhone 17 Pro. You're much better off with normal nice 4K recording. Then I also tested the stabilization on this phone, and in my normal walking through a forest test here, it performs pretty well in my opinion, on a similar level as the iPhone 17 Pro I would say. Of course the Samsung again is way cooler than the iPhone in terms of colors and white balance, and now there's also a super steady mode which should mitigate camera shake even more, but it does crop in quite a bit, and at least for normal walking it didn't make things better, rather the opposite in my opinion. And it is the same story on the iPhone with its action mode, which is the equivalent. But of course this is only walking, and for real action the results may very well be different. Now I also tested the front camera and microphone for the vloggers out there. So this is a microphone slash front camera slash video stabilization test. I'm walking at a comfortable pace here. And I think the Samsung is quite good in that regard. It is nicely stabilized, and the image quality of the front camera is also quite good again. For the iPhone comparison, I'm again using the front camera of my girlfriend's 15 Pro here. So this is a front camera slash stabilization slash microphone test on the iPhone 15 Pro here. Same pace as on the Samsung. While it does preserve the highlights a tiny bit better, I think that the Samsung overall looks a bit better and definitely has better stabilization. In terms of microphone quality, I also think that the Samsung is quite good, although I feel that the audio is a bit off to the right, if that makes sense. Now, I don't know about the exact microphone placement, but it just feels a bit more unbalanced in comparison to the iPhone. But maybe this is just me. Overall, I think that similar to the front camera test for still photography, I think that the Samsung performs quite well for this type of videos. Then finally, I also had a brief look at slow motion capabilities. And while the Samsung offers 4K 60, I don't think that this gives you enough slow motion when slowed down in post. And also most people who are buying this phone probably want something in camera anyway. So I tested the dedicated slow motion feature where we can choose between 4K 120 or 1080 at 240 frames per second. Now, similar to iPhones and most other phones for that matter, the quality of this slow motion clips is not amazing, with the 240 here being way worse than the 120 of course. Alright, so what is my overall conclusion to the camera capabilities of the Samsung Galaxy S25 Fan Edition? I would say, especially for photography, it is a really solid performer at this kind of mid-range price level. The main wide-angle camera is very good, and as long as you stick to that and don't play too much with the ultrawide and the telephoto lens, you'll get great results in a wide range of scenarios. Speaking of these other two cameras, I think they serve more of a marketing purpose, like a wow, it has 3 cameras and the like, than anything else really. And for me personally as a photographer, I would much rather see Samsung, at least at the mid-range here, focus on only the main camera and get rid of the other two, or just get rid of the other two and make the phone $100 to $200 cheaper. That said, the S25 Fan Edition does perform where it matters for most people, and that is the main camera as well as the excellent front-facing camera. Now, for video, I would say it is okay, it is fine, but if you're really serious about video, I think iPhones are just a lot better, and maybe a used 15 Pro at roughly the same price, but with ProRes capabilities and Apple Lock is the better choice then. Looking beyond camera quality for a second, I think that this is a great does-it-all phone that is priced very well and looks amazing, as all recent Samsung phones in my opinion really. such clean design. I like it a lot better than the iPhone design, for example. Now, if you want to get yourself a Samsung S25 Fan Edition, there is a link down below, as well as to the iPhone 17 Pro and all the major gear I'm using. These are affiliate links, so buying something through those will get me a small commission, and that does help the channel a lot, as at this point I don't yet get review units from phone companies, so it is a bit of a financial struggle to get my hands on one of these newer phones. Of course, liking and subscribing also helps a ton. And also please comment below which phone you'd be interested in for a future in-depth camera review. Alright, thank you very much guys. That's it. Have a great week. Bye bye.